the Gnostic Jesus, the secret texts that prove he never wanted to be God. In the summer of 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi when his shovel struck something hard buried in the sand. What he unearthed that day would shake the foundations of Christianity itself. 13 leather-bound books, sealed in a clay jar for over 1,500 years, containing texts so controversial that early church leaders tried to burn every copy they could find. These weren't just any ancient manuscripts. These were the lost Gospels of the Gnostics, and they tell a radically different story about Jesus Christ. Not the divine Son of God, who came to earth to die for our sins, but a wisdom teacher who explicitly rejected claims of his own divinity and taught that the true path to salvation lay not in worshipping him, but in discovering the divine spark that already existed within each human soul. For nearly 2,000 years, Orthodox Christianity has maintained that Jesus claimed to be God incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, who willingly sacrificed himself for humanity's redemption. But what if everything we've been told about Jesus' divine claims is wrong? What if the secret texts discovered at Nag Hammadi reveal a Jesus who would be horrified by the religion that bears his name today? I'm going to take you inside these forbidden Gospels and show you exactly what they say about Jesus' true teachings. We'll examine the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus speaks like a mystical philosopher rather than a divine savior. We'll explore the secret book of John, which reveals Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom, not a God to be worshipped. And we'll uncover the Gospel of Philip, where Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene suggests a very human spiritual leader, not the celibate deity of Orthodox doctrine. But here's what makes this discovery even more explosive. These texts weren't written centuries after Jesus' death by later heretics trying to distort his message. Leading scholars now believe some of these Gospels may have been composed just as early as the canonical Gospels we know today, potentially preserving traditions that go back to Jesus' immediate followers. The implications are staggering. If these texts are authentic, then the entire foundation of Christianity as we know it crumbles. The divinity of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, the necessity of Jesus' sacrificial death, all of it becomes a later invention by church leaders who transformed a humble wisdom teacher into a god. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the plot of a Dan Brown novel, not serious historical scholarship. But the reality is far more nuanced and far more fascinating than any work of fiction. The Gnostic texts don't present Jesus as a conspiracy theory or a hidden bloodline. Instead, they reveal a profoundly spiritual teacher whose message was so radically different from what later became Orthodox Christianity that it had to be suppressed. The story begins in the earliest decades after Jesus' crucifixion, when multiple competing versions of Christianity were fighting for dominance. What we now call Orthodox Christianity was just one faction among many, and it wasn't necessarily the largest or most influential in those early years. The Gnostics represented another major stream of Christian thought, one that claimed to preserve the secret teachings Jesus had given only to his inner circle of disciples. According to Gnostic tradition, after his resurrection, Jesus spent additional time with select followers, revealing deeper mysteries that couldn't be shared with the general public. These weren't just theological refinements or additional moral teachings. They were radical reinterpretations of the entire cosmic order, explanations of humanity's true nature, and destiny that turned conventional religious thinking upside down. The Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most famous of these secret texts, presents Jesus as a teacher of paradoxical wisdom, sayings rather than the miracle-working Son of God portrayed in the canonical Gospels. When his disciples ask him to reveal his true nature, Jesus responds not with claims of divinity, but with cryptic statements designed to provoke spiritual awakening. He tells them that the kingdom of heaven is not a future realm to be entered after death, but a present reality that can be discovered within oneself. Even more striking is what the Gospel of Thomas doesn't contain. There's no virgin birth narrative, no account of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, no great commission to spread the gospel to all nations. Instead, Jesus appears as what we might today call an enlightened master, someone who has achieved a higher state of consciousness and is trying to guide others to that same of this portrayalization. The implications you'll become even more radical when we examine Jesus' actual words in these texts. In saying after saying, he consistently deflects attempts to worship him or treat him as a divine being. When pressed about his identity, he responds by pointing his questioners back to their own inner nature, suggesting that whatever divine qualities they see in him already exist within themselves. This theme runs throughout the Gnostic literature. In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus is described as someone who became the Christ through a process of spiritual development, not someone who was born divine. The text suggests that this same transformation is available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary inner work. The goal isn't to worship Jesus, but to follow his example and achieve the same state of spiritual realization he attained. The secret book of John takes this concept even further, presenting Jesus as a revealer of cosmic knowledge rather than a savior figure. In this text, Jesus explains to John the Apostle the true nature of reality, describing how the material world came into being through the actions of a false god called the Demiurge. According to this account, the supreme divine reality is so transcendent that it cannot be directly involved in creating the physical universe. What makes this cosmology particularly relevant to understanding Jesus' role is how it reframes the entire concept of salvation. In Orthodox Christianity, humans are fallen beings who need to be saved from sin through Jesus' sacrificial death. But in the Gnostic system revealed in the secret book of John, humans are divine sparks trapped in material bodies, and salvation comes through awakening to this inner divinity rather than through external rescue. Jesus' function in this framework is not to die for humanity's sins, but to awaken people to their true nature. He's a teacher and guide, someone who has remembered his divine origin and is helping others do the same. This radically alters the entire dynamic of the Christian message, shifting it from a religion of worship and dependence to a path of self-discovery and spiritual empowerment. The Gospel of Mary provides another fascinating perspective on these themes, particularly through its portrayal of Mary Magdalene as Jesus' closest disciple and the recipient of his most advanced teachings. In this text, Mary is presented as someone who understood Jesus' message better than the male disciples, leading to tension and jealousy among the apostles. What's particularly striking about the Gospel of Mary is how it depicts Jesus' relationship with his followers. Rather than demanding obedience and worship, he engages in sophisticated philosophical discussions about the nature of reality and consciousness. He treats his disciples as peers capable of achieving the same level of understanding he has attained, not as subordinates who must simply believe without question. This egalitarian approach extends to Jesus' treatment of women in these texts. Unlike the canonical Gospels, where women play supporting roles, the Gnostic texts often portray female disciples as equal or even superior to their male counterparts in terms of spiritual insight. Mary Magdalene, in particular, is frequently depicted as Jesus' spiritual partner and the one who best comprehends his teachings. The Gospel of Philip goes so far as to suggest that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, or at least in a committed romantic relationship. While this claim has been sensationalized in popular culture, its real significance lies in what it suggests about Jesus' humanity. If Jesus was married, it would indicate that he was a fully human teacher who happened to achieve extraordinary spiritual insight, rather than a divine being who merely appeared to be human. This brings us to one of the most fundamental differences between Gnostic and Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox doctrine insists that Jesus was both fully God and fully human, a paradoxical formulation that has puzzled theologians for centuries. But many Gnostic texts take a completely different approach, suggesting that Jesus was a human being who achieved a divine state of consciousness through spiritual development. Some Gnostic schools went even further, embracing what scholars call Docetism, the belief that Jesus only appeared to be human, but was actually a purely spiritual being. According to this view, Jesus' physical body was an illusion, and his apparent death on the cross was similarly illusory. This might seem to elevate Jesus' divine status, but it actually serves the opposite purpose in Gnostic theology. If Jesus never really became human, then his achievement becomes less remarkable, not more so. The truly impressive accomplishment would be for a human being to achieve divine consciousness while remaining fully human. This is exactly what many Gnostic texts suggest happened, and it's why they present Jesus as an example to follow rather than a god to worship. The Gospel of Judas provides perhaps the most radical reinterpretation of Jesus' story, suggesting that Judas's betrayal was actually carried out at Jesus' own request. According to this text, Jesus understood that his physical death was necessary to free his spirit from the limitations of the material world. Rather than being the villain of the story, Judas becomes Jesus' most trusted disciple, the only one capable of helping him achieve his ultimate spiritual goal. This completely inverts the traditional Christian narrative of sacrifice and redemption. Instead of dying to save humanity from sin, Jesus dies to demonstrate the illusory nature of physical existence and the eternal reality of the spirit. His death becomes not a unique salvific event, but an example of the kind of spiritual transcendence available to anyone willing to let go of attachment to the material world. These alternative interpretations weren't just theological curiosities confined to scholarly debates. They represented fundamentally different approaches to spiritual life, with radically different implications for how people should relate to the divine, to each other, and to the world around them. The Gnostic approach to spirituality was fundamentally democratic, in a way that would have threatened the emerging hierarchy of the early church. If every person contained a divine spark that could be awakened through proper knowledge and spiritual practice, then what need was there for priests, bishops, or elaborate institutional structures? The Gnostic Jesus wasn't building a church. He was teaching individuals how to discover their own direct connection to the divine. This is precisely why these texts were so dangerous to the Orthodox Christian establishment. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, church leaders were consolidating power and establishing doctrinal boundaries. They needed a Jesus who was uniquely divine, whose authority could be channeled exclusively through approved ecclesiastical channels. A Jesus who taught that everyone could achieve the same spiritual realization he had attained was incompatible with this emerging power structure. The Gospel of Thomas makes this tension explicit in several of its sayings. When the disciples ask Jesus about fasting, prayer, and charitable giving, the traditional pillars of religious observance, Jesus responds cryptically, suggesting that these external practices might actually be harmful if they distract from inner spiritual work. He tells them that the kingdom of heaven cannot be found through conventional religious activities, but only through self-knowledge and direct spiritual insight. Even more provocatively, Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas suggests that his followers should not create institutions or appoint leaders after his departure. When asked who will guide them when he's gone, he points them to James the Just, but emphasizes that ultimate authority lies within each individual's capacity for spiritual discernment. This stands in stark contrast to the canonical Gospels, where Jesus explicitly establishes Peter as the rock upon which his church will be built. The difference becomes even more pronounced when we examine how these texts approach the concept of salvation itself. Orthodox Christianity developed the doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the idea that Jesus' death paid the penalty for human sin, making reconciliation with God possible. But this entire framework is absent from most Gnostic texts, which instead present salvation as a process of awakening to one's true nature. In the secret book of John, Jesus explains that humans don't need to be saved from sin, because sin itself is largely an illusion created by ignorance of one's divine nature. The real problem isn't moral failure, but spiritual amnesia, a forgetting of one's true identity as a spark of the divine trapped in material existence. Salvation comes not through faith in Jesus' sacrifice, but through gnosis, the direct experiential knowledge of one's spiritual reality. This shift from faith to knowledge represents one of the most fundamental differences between Gnostic and Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox doctrine emphasizes belief in propositions about Jesus' nature and work, while Gnostic texts focus on direct spiritual experience and self-discovery. The Jesus of the canonical Gospels asks people to believe that he is the Son of God, while the Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels asks people to discover the divine reality within themselves. The practical implications of this difference are enormous. Orthodox Christianity creates a relationship of dependence between believers and the divine, mediated through Jesus and the institutional church. Gnostic Christianity encourages a relationship of spiritual equality, where the goal is to achieve the same level of consciousness that Jesus attained. One system creates worshippers, the other creates potential equals. This egalitarian emphasis extends to the Gnostic treatment of gender roles as well. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene not just as a disciple, but as someone whose spiritual insight surpasses that of the male apostles. When Peter objects to Jesus giving private teachings to a woman, Jesus responds by defending Mary's capacity for spiritual understanding and suggesting that gender is irrelevant to spiritual achievement. The Gospel of Philip goes even further, using the metaphor of marriage to describe the ultimate spiritual union that both men and women can achieve. In this text, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene becomes a symbol for the integration of masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness, a mystical marriage that represents spiritual wholeness rather than mere romantic attachment. These themes would have been revolutionary in the ancient world, where women were generally excluded from religious leadership and higher spiritual teachings. The Gnostic texts consistently present women as capable of achieving the same level of spiritual realization as men, and in some cases as being naturally more inclined toward the kind of intuitive wisdom that Gnostic spirituality emphasized. But perhaps the most radical aspect of the Gnostic worldview was its complete rejection of the material world as the creation of the true God. According to texts like the Secret Book of John, the physical universe was created by a false deity called the Dakenli Belivimurge, who missed himself to be the supreme God. This cosmic error trapped divine sparks in material bodies, creating the illusion of separation from the true divine realm. This dualistic cosmology had profound implications for how Gnostics understood Jesus' mission. He wasn't coming to redeem the material world or to establish God's kingdom on earth. Instead, he was revealing the illusory nature of physical existence and teaching people how to escape from material bondage back to their true spiritual home. The Gospel of Judas presents this theme most dramatically, suggesting that Jesus actually welcomed his physical death because it would free him from the limitations of embodied existence. In this interpretation, the crucifixion isn't a tragic sacrifice, but a triumphant liberation, demonstrating that physical death has no power over spiritual reality. This perspective completely transforms the meaning of Jesus' teachings about suffering and persecution. In Orthodox Christianity, suffering is often seen as redemptive, following Jesus' example of sacrificial love. But in Gnostic interpretation, suffering is simply a consequence of being trapped in material existence, and the goal is not to embrace it, but to transcend it through spiritual knowledge. The Gnostic Jesus doesn't glorify poverty, persecution, or physical hardship. Instead, he teaches methods for rising above material circumstances through consciousness transformation. His message isn't about finding God through suffering, but about discovering that one's true identity was never subject to suffering in the first place. This radically different approach to spirituality explains why the Gnostic texts were eventually suppressed by Orthodox Christianity. They didn't just offer alternative interpretations of Jesus' teachings, they presented an entirely different spiritual path that threatened the foundations of institutional religious authority. The Orthodox Church Fathers understood exactly what was at stake. If people could achieve direct spiritual realization without institutional mediation, if they could discover their own divine nature without priestly intervention, if they could transcend material existence through personal spiritual practice, rather than through participation in church sacraments, then the entire edifice of organized Christianity would become unnecessary. The suppression of these texts wasn't just about theological correctness, it was about power and control. The Gnostic Jesus was too democratic, too egalitarian, too focused on individual spiritual empowerment to serve the needs of an institution that was trying to establish itself as the sole mediator between humanity and the divine. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, this institutionalization process was complete. The Gnostic texts were declared heretical, their followers were persecuted, and their libraries were burned. The Jesus who taught self-discovery and spiritual equality was replaced by the Jesus who demanded worship and institutional allegiance. But the texts survived, buried in the Egyptian desert, waiting for a farmer's shovel to bring them back to light. And what they reveal challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of Christianity and the true message of its founder. The question we must confront is why these alternative accounts of Jesus were ultimately rejected by mainstream Christianity. The answer reveals as much about the political realities of the early church as it does about theological differences. When we examine the historical context surrounding the suppression of Gnostic texts, we discover a complex struggle for religious authority that fundamentally shaped the Christianity we know today. In the early centuries after Jesus' death, Christianity wasn't the monolithic religion we recognize now. It was a diverse collection of communities, each with their own interpretations of Jesus' message and their own sacred texts. The Gnostic communities weren't fringe heretical groups operating on the margins of Christianity. Archaeological evidence suggests they were significant, well-established Christian communities with their own churches, rituals, and leadership structures. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, shows clear signs of being used in regular worship services, not just as an esoteric text for spiritual adepts. The sayings are structured in ways that suggest they were memorized and recited, much like the canonical Gospels. This indicates that entire Christian communities built their spiritual lives around a very different understanding of Jesus than what eventually became Orthodox doctrine. What's particularly fascinating is how these communities interpreted Jesus' most famous teachings. Take the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most beloved passages in Christianity. Orthodox interpretation focuses on Jesus' moral teachings about loving one's enemies, turning the other cheek, and caring for the poor. But Gnostic texts suggest these teachings had deeper esoteric meanings related to consciousness transformation and spiritual awakening. In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus' command to love one's enemies is interpreted not as ethical instruction, but as recognition that apparent enemies are actually aspects of oneself that need to be integrated. The teaching about turning the other cheek becomes a metaphor for transcending dualistic thinking, rather than simply about non-violent resistance. This doesn't diminish the moral dimension of these teachings, but it adds layers of meaning that point toward the kind of inner transformation the Gnostic Jesus emphasized. The parable of the pearl of great price takes on particularly rich meaning in Gnostic interpretation. While Orthodox Christianity typically understands this as teaching about the supreme value of the kingdom of heaven, Gnostic texts suggest it refers to the divine spark within each person that's worth sacrificing everything else to discover. The merchant who sells all his possessions to buy the pearl becomes a metaphor for someone willing to abandon all external identities and attachments to realize their true spiritual nature. This interpretive approach extended to Jesus' miracle stories as well. The Gnostic texts don't necessarily deny that Jesus performed miracles, but they understand them primarily as demonstrations of the spiritual powers available to anyone who achieves the same level of consciousness. The healing of the blind becomes a symbol for spiritual awakening. The multiplication of loaves and fishes represents the abundance that flows from understanding one's divine nature. The raising of the dead points to the eternal life that comes from realizing one's true identity beyond physical existence. The Gospel of Mary presents one of the most detailed accounts of how Jesus actually taught these deeper meanings to his inner circle of disciples. According to this text, Jesus would often give public teachings that had one level of meaning for general audiences, while privately explaining more advanced spiritual concepts to those ready to receive them. This creates a picture of Jesus as a sophisticated spiritual teacher who adapted his message to his audience's level of understanding. Mary Magdalene emerges in this text as someone who particularly excelled at grasping these hidden meanings. When the other disciples struggle to understand Jesus' more cryptic teachings, Mary is able to explain them with clarity and depth. This portrayal suggests that spiritual insight, not gender or social position, determined who could access Jesus' most advanced teachings. The tension this creates with Peter and the other male disciples reflects broader conflicts within early Christianity about authority and spiritual leadership. The canonical Gospels consistently portray Peter as the primary spokesman for the disciples and Jesus' chosen successor. But the Gospel of Mary suggests that Peter's impulsive nature and attachment to conventional thinking actually made him less as deeper teachings than capable of understanding Jesus Mary was. This conflict comes to a head in a dramatic scene where Peter openly challenges Mary's authority to share Jesus' private revelations. He asks whether Jesus really would have given secret teachings to a woman that he didn't share with the male disciples. Andrew supports Peter's skepticism, but Levi defends Mary, pointing out that Jesus clearly loved her more than the other disciples and trusted her with his most important teachings. The scene reveals fundamental disagreements about the nature of spiritual authority in early Christianity. Peter represents the institutional model where authority comes from official appointment and group consensus. Mary represents the Gnostic model where authority comes from direct spiritual insight and understanding. These weren't just personal conflicts between individual disciples, but competing visions of how Jesus' movement should be organized and led. The Gospel of Judas adds another layer to this picture by suggesting that none of the disciples, including Mary, fully understood Jesus' ultimate message during his lifetime. According to this text, even Judas, who is portrayed as Jesus' closest confidant, only partially grasps what Jesus is trying to accomplish through his death. The implication is that Jesus' true teachings could only be fully understood after his physical departure, when his followers could experience the spiritual realities he had been pointing toward. This creates a very different picture of Jesus' relationship with his disciples than we find in the canonical Gospels. Instead of being the confident leader of a devoted band of followers, Jesus emerges as something more like a frustrated teacher whose students keep missing the point of his lessons. He loves them and continues working with them, but he knows they're not ready for the full implications of what he's trying to communicate. The secret book of John provides the most systematic presentation of these advanced teachings that Jesus supposedly gave after his resurrection. In this text, Jesus appears to John in a vision and explains the true nature of reality in terms that sound remarkably similar to what we might today call quantum physics or consciousness studies. He describes multiple dimensions of reality, the illusory nature of physical existence, and the fundamental interconnectedness of all consciousness. What makes this cosmological system particularly relevant to understanding Jesus' role is how it explains the relationship between individual consciousness and universal consciousness. According to this text, what we think of as separate individual minds are actually aspects of a single cosmic consciousness that has temporarily forgotten its true nature. Jesus' function is to remind people of this fundamental unity and help them remember their true identity. This framework makes Jesus' famous statements about unity with the Father take on radically different meanings. When Jesus says, "I and the Father are one" in the Gospel of John, Orthodox Christianity interprets this as a statement about his unique divine nature. But the Gnostic texts suggest this same unity is available to everyone who realizes their true spiritual identity. Jesus isn't claiming exclusive divinity, but demonstrating the level of consciousness that represents humanity's ultimate potential. The Gospel of Thomas makes this interpretation explicit in several sayings, where Jesus tells his disciples they will become like him when they achieve the same level of understanding. He doesn't present himself as permanently superior to his followers, but as someone who has achieved a state of consciousness they can also attain. The goal isn't to worship Jesus, but to follow his example and realize the same spiritual potential he discovered. This teaching about human spiritual potential created profound theological problems for the developing Orthodox Church. If everyone could potentially achieve the same level of consciousness as Jesus, what made him unique? If the divine spark existed in every person, why did humanity need salvation through Jesus' sacrifice? If direct spiritual experience was available to individuals, why did they need institutional mediation? These questions threatened the entire foundation of ecclesiastical authority that church leaders were trying to establish. The emerging Christian hierarchy needed Jesus to be permanently unique, forever separate from ordinary humanity, accessible only through approved channels. A Jesus who taught spiritual equality and individual empowerment was incompatible with this institutional agenda. The process of suppressing Gnostic Christianity wasn't sudden or simple. It took place over several centuries and involved complex political maneuvering as much as theological argument. Different Christian communities had different levels of influence depending on their geographic location, their relationships with Roman authorities, and their economic resources. The communities that eventually won the struggle for Orthodox dominance weren't necessarily the ones with the most authentic connection to Jesus' original teachings. The Gospel of Philip provides insight into how this struggle played out at the community level. This text describes tensions between different Christian groups, with some emphasizing external religious observances and others focusing on inner spiritual transformation. The text clearly favors the inner approach, suggesting that those who rely on external practices are missing the point of Jesus' message. But these weren't just abstract theological differences. They had practical implications for how Christian communities were organized and how they related to the broader society. Gnostic communities tended to be more egalitarian, with women playing leadership roles and decisions being made through spiritual discernment, rather than hierarchical authority. Orthodox communities developed more structured leadership patterns that mirrored Roman administrative models. The political advantages of the Orthodox model became apparent when Christianity began attracting the attention of Roman authorities. Imperial officials found it much easier to deal with hierarchically organized churches that had clear leadership structures and standardized doctrines. The diverse, democratically organized Gnostic communities were harder to control and more difficult to co-opt for political purposes. This political dimension of the struggle between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity helps explain why certain texts were preserved while others were suppressed. The Gospels that eventually became canonical weren't necessarily the oldest or most authentic, but they were the ones that supported the kind of institutional structure that proved most compatible with Roman imperial needs. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library forces us to reconsider these historical developments and ask whether the Christianity that won the institutional struggle was actually the Christianity that best preserved Jesus' original message. The texts buried in that Egyptian jar suggest that alternative interpretations of Jesus' teachings might have been not just different, but potentially more authentic than what became Orthodox doctrine. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond academic debates about early Christian history. If the Gnostic texts preserve aspects of Jesus' teaching that were suppressed by institutional Christianity, then millions of people throughout history might have been prevented from accessing spiritual insights that Jesus intended to share. The democratic, egalitarian, inner-focused spirituality of Gnostic Christianity might represent a lost dimension of Jesus' message that's desperately needed in our contemporary world. The Jesus who emerges from these secret texts isn't the remote divine figure of Orthodox theology, but a spiritual teacher whose message of human potential and direct divine access remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. Whether we accept these texts as historically authentic or not, they challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about Christianity's founder and the movement he inspired. The question of whether these alternative accounts should be taken seriously as historical documents brings us to one of the most contentious debates in biblical scholarship today. When scholars examine the manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi, they're not just looking at theological curiosities or ancient religious speculation. They're confronting texts that some researchers believe may preserve traditions that go back to the earliest decades of Christianity, possibly even to Jesus' immediate followers. The dating of these documents presents a fascinating puzzle that challenges conventional assumptions about early Christian development. While Orthodox scholars have traditionally argued that Gnostic texts were late compositions written well after the canonical Gospels, recent archaeological and linguistic analysis suggests a more complex picture. Some portions of the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, may contain sayings, traditions that are as old as, or possibly older than, the sources used by the canonical Gospel writers. This possibility transforms our understanding of early Christian diversity. Instead of seeing Gnosticism as a later corruption of original Christian teaching, we might need to recognize it as one of several competing interpretations that emerged simultaneously in the decades immediately following Jesus' death. The Jesus movement wasn't a unified phenomenon from the beginning, but rather a collection of communities trying to make sense of their founder's life and teachings in radically different ways. The Gospel of Thomas provides perhaps the clearest window into this alternative understanding of Jesus' message. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which present Jesus within narrative frameworks of birth, ministry, death, and resurrection, Thomas offers only sayings attributed to Jesus, with minimal contextual information. This stripped-down format might actually preserve a more primitive layer of tradition, representing how Jesus' teachings were first remembered and transmitted. What makes these sayings particularly intriguing is their consistent emphasis on inner transformation rather than external religious observance. Jesus repeatedly points his listeners away from conventional religious practices and toward direct spiritual insight. When asked about fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, he responds cryptically, suggesting these activities might actually impede spiritual progress if they become substitutes for genuine inner work. The most famous example appears in saying 114, where Jesus declares that Mary Magdalene will become like a living spirit when she makes herself male, because only males can enter the kingdom of heaven. This saying has puzzled scholars for decades, but within the broader context of Gnostic spirituality, it likely refers to the integration of masculine and feminine psychological principles rather than literal gender transformation. The kingdom Jesus describes isn't a place reserved for biological males, but a state of consciousness achieved through psychological wholeness. This interpretive approach reveals layers of meaning in Jesus' teachings that completely reframe his spiritual message. The kingdom of heaven isn't a future destination, but a present reality accessible through consciousness transformation. The salvation Jesus offers isn't rescue from divine punishment, but awakening from spiritual ignorance. The eternal life he promises isn't survival after bodily death, but recognition of one's timeless spiritual nature. The secret book of John elaborates these themes into a comprehensive cosmological system that explains how consciousness became trapped in material existence and how it can be liberated. According to this text, the supreme divine reality is so transcendent that it cannot be directly involved in creating the physical world. Instead, creation occurs through a series of emanations, spiritual beings called aeons, that progressively move further from the divine source. The crisis occurs when one of these aeons, Sophia or wisdom, attempts to know the unknowable supreme reality without her divine partner. This presumptuous act generates a distorted offspring called Yaldabaoth, or the demiurge, who becomes the creator of the material universe. Crucially, this false god believes himself to be the supreme deity and demands worship from the beings he creates, not realizing he is merely an ignorant product of Sophia's error. This cosmic narrative provides the framework for understanding humanity's predicament and Jesus' role in resolving it. Humans are divine sparks trapped in material bodies by the demiurge's deception. They've forgotten their true spiritual nature and mistakenly identify with their physical existence. Jesus' mission is to remind them of their divine origin and teach them how to escape from material bondage back to their true spiritual home. This cosmology completely inverts traditional Christian theology. The God of the Old Testament, who creates the world and demands obedience from his creatures, becomes the ignorant demiurge who traps divine consciousness in matter. The true God remains utterly transcendent and can only be approached through direct spiritual experience, not through worship or religious observance. Salvation doesn't come through faith in external authority, but through gnosis, the direct experiential knowledge of one's spiritual reality. The practical implications of this worldview shaped every aspect of Gnostic Christian life. If the material world was the creation of a false god, then conventional religious practices that focused on physical activities like ritual sacrifice, ceremonial washing, or communal meals were not just unnecessary but potentially harmful. They reinforced the illusion that spiritual reality could be accessed through material means, preventing people from discovering the divine spark within themselves. This didn't necessarily lead to complete withdrawal from physical existence, as critics of Gnosticism often claim. Many Gnostic communities were actively engaged in their societies and developed sophisticated ethical systems. But their approach to ethics was fundamentally different from Orthodox Christianity. Instead of following external moral commands, Gnostics were encouraged to act from their awakened divine nature, allowing their inner spiritual reality to guide their behavior. The Gospel of Philip explores this ethical dimension through its extended meditation on the nature of spiritual marriage. In this text, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene becomes a symbol for the integration of consciousness that represents true spiritual maturity. Physical marriage is seen as a reflection of this deeper spiritual union, valuable insofar as it points toward the ultimate goal of psychological wholeness. This perspective on sexuality and relationships stands in stark contrast to the ascetic tendencies that developed in Orthodox Christianity. While some Gnostic groups did embrace extreme asceticism, others saw physical relationships as potential vehicles for spiritual development. The key was not to reject the body, but to understand its proper role in the larger process of consciousness transformation. The Gospel of Mary develops this theme further by presenting Mary Magdalene as someone who achieved the kind of spiritual maturity that made her Jesus' equal partner in teaching. When the other disciples struggle to understand Jesus' more advanced concepts, Mary is able to explain them with authority and clarity. Her gender doesn't disqualify her from spiritual leadership. Rather, her level of understanding makes her uniquely qualified to guide others. This egalitarian approach to spiritual authority created serious problems for the emerging church hierarchy. If spiritual insight rather than institutional appointment determined who could teach and lead, then the entire structure of ecclesiastical authority became questionable. Women, slaves, and other marginalized groups could potentially claim spiritual authority based on their level of understanding rather than their social position. The tension between these competing models of authority plays out dramatically in several Gnostic texts. The Gospel of Mary describes Peter's jealousy when Jesus gives private teachings to Mary that he doesn't share with the male disciples. Peter asks whether Jesus would really reveal secrets to a woman that he concealed from men, revealing his assumption that gender determines spiritual capacity. Levi responds by defending Mary and pointing out that Jesus obviously trusted her with his most important teachings. This scene reflects broader conflicts within early Christianity about the role of women in religious leadership. The canonical Gospels preserve hints of these tensions, such as Paul's contradictory statements about women's participation in worship services. But the Gnostic texts present them much more explicitly, suggesting that debates about gender and authority were central to early Christian community life. The Gospel of Judas offers perhaps the most radical reinterpretation of apostolic authority by presenting Judas as Jesus' most trusted disciple rather than his betrayer. According to this text, Jesus specifically chose Judas to facilitate his crucifixion because only Judas was capable of understanding that physical death would liberate Jesus from material bondage. The betrayal becomes an act of ultimate loyalty, carried out in service of Jesus' deeper spiritual purpose. This complete inversion of traditional Christian narrative demonstrates how thoroughly the Gnostic texts challenge conventional understandings of Jesus' story. Every element that Orthodox Christianity presents as central to the faith, from Jesus' unique divinity to his sacrificial death to the apostolic succession through Peter, is reinterpreted or rejected entirely. The result is a form of Christianity that would be virtually unrecognizable to most contemporary Christians. Yet these texts claim to preserve the authentic teachings of Jesus, the secret wisdom that he shared only with his most advanced disciples. They present themselves not as alternative interpretations developed centuries later, but as the original message that was gradually suppressed by church leaders who preferred external authority to inner spiritual development. The historical evidence for these claims remains hotly debated among scholars. Orthodox historians argue that the Gnostic texts show clear signs of later philosophical influence, particularly from Platonic and Neoplatonic sources that wouldn't have been available to Jesus' immediate followers. They point to the complex cosmological systems in texts like the Secret Book of John as evidence that these ideas developed through interaction with Greek philosophy rather than from Palestinian Jewish roots. Gnostic scholars counter that Jewish mystical traditions contained many of the same themes that appear in the Nag Hammadi texts. They argue that apocalyptic literature, wisdom traditions, and Merkaba mysticism provided precedents for the kind of esoteric teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gnostic Gospels. The dualistic cosmologies and emphasis on hidden knowledge weren't foreign imports, but developments of ideas already present in first-century Judaism. The debate becomes even more complex when we consider the political context surrounding the formation of the biblical canon. The process of determining which texts would be considered authoritative scripture wasn't based solely on theological considerations or historical authenticity. Political factors, including the need to present a unified front against Roman persecution and later to accommodate imperial patronage, played crucial roles in determining which versions of Christianity survived. The Gnostic texts that were buried at Nag Hammadi represent voices that were systematically excluded from these political processes. They preserve perspectives that might have been more widespread in early Christianity than the eventual dominance of Orthodox doctrine would suggest. Archaeological evidence from sites like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt shows that Gnostic and Orthodox texts circulated side by side in some communities well into the 4th century. This evidence suggests that the sharp distinction between Orthodox and heretical Christianity that later church historians drew might not reflect the actual diversity of early Christian communities. Many Christians probably participated in both Orthodox and Gnostic traditions, seeing them as complementary rather than contradictory approaches to understanding Jesus' message. The Gospel of Thomas, in particular, shows signs of having been used in regular worship alongside canonical texts. Its structure suggests it was designed for memorization and recitation, indicating that entire communities built their spiritual practice around these alternative sayings of Jesus. The fact that multiple copies were found at Nag Hammadi suggests these texts were widely distributed and carefully preserved by communities that value them as authentic scripture. The question of authenticity ultimately depends on how we understand the relationship between historical accuracy and spiritual truth. Even if the Gnostic texts don't preserve Jesus' exact words, they might capture aspects of his spiritual vision that were lost or suppressed in the canonical tradition. The emphasis on inner transformation, direct spiritual experience, and human divine potential resonates with mystical traditions throughout history and across cultures. Contemporary scholars like Elaine Pagels and Karen King have argued that the Gnostic texts offer resources for addressing problems in modern Christianity that stem from its emphasis on external authority and institutional mediation. The democratic, experiential spirituality of Gnostic Christianity might provide alternatives to authoritarian religious structures that many people find oppressive or irrelevant. The Jesus who emerges from these secret texts speaks to contemporary spiritual seekers in ways that the Orthodox Christ often cannot. His message of human potential and direct divine access resonates with movements ranging from liberal Christianity to New Age spirituality to secular mindfulness practices. Whether historically accurate or not, the Gnostic Jesus offers a vision of spiritual development that many people find more compelling than traditional Christian doctrine. This contemporary relevance helps explain why the Nag Hammadi discovery has generated such intense popular interest despite its academic complexity. Books like the Da Vinci Code may sensationalize and distort the historical evidence, but they tap into genuine spiritual hunger for alternatives to institutional Christianity. The Gnostic texts provide those alternatives, presenting a Jesus who empowers rather than demands submission, who teaches self-discovery rather than blind faith. The controversy surrounding these texts reflects deeper tensions within contemporary Christianity about authority, interpretation, and spiritual practice. Conservative Christians see the Gnostic Gospels as dangerous deceptions that threaten the foundations of Orthodox faith. Progressive Christians find in them resources for renewal and reform that could revalidate volatilize Christian spirit to modern audiences. Academic scholars continue to debate the historical questions surrounding these texts, but their spiritual and cultural impact has already been profound. They forced Christians to confront the diversity of early Christianity and to question assumptions about doctrinal development that seemed settled for centuries. They've provided ammunition for feminist theologians challenging patriarchal interpretations of Christian tradition. They've inspired new forms of Christian practice that emphasize mystical experience over dogmatic belief. Perhaps most importantly, they've revealed that the Christianity we know today represents only one strand of a much richer and more complex tradition. The Jesus who was eventually declared to be the second person of the Trinity, whose death was interpreted as substitutionary atonement for human sin, whose authority was channeled through apostolic succession, was not the only Jesus that early Christians knew and followed. The Jesus of the Gnostic texts offers a fundamentally different vision of spiritual life, one that emphasizes human potential rather than human depravity, direct experience rather than mediated authority, inner transformation rather than external salvation. Whether this Jesus is historically more authentic than the Orthodox Christ may be less important than whether his message addresses spiritual needs that Orthodox Christianity has failed to meet. The secret texts buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years have finally returned to challenge our assumptions about Christianity's founder and his message. They remind us that the religion that conquered the Roman Empire and shaped Western civilization was not inevitable, not the only possible interpretation of Jesus' life and teachings. Other paths were possible. Other understandings were available. Other forms of Christian life were practiced by communities that saw themselves as faithful followers of the same teacher. These alternative voices were silenced, their texts burned, their perspectives marginalized and forgotten. But the desert preserved what human authority tried to destroy, and now these long-buried Gospels speak again, offering their vision of a Jesus who taught not submission, but empowerment, not worship, but awakening, not dependence, but the discovery of one's own divine nature. The implications of this discovery continue to reverberate through contemporary Christianity and beyond, challenging believers and skeptics alike to reconsider what they think they know about one of history's most influential figures. The conversation between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity that was cut short in the 4th century has resumed, and its outcome may determine the future direction of Christian spirituality in the 21st century and beyond. The stakes of this rediscovered conversation extend far beyond academic theology or historical curiosity. When we examine the practical implications of the Gnostic worldview, we discover teachings that directly contradict some of Christianity's most fundamental assumptions about human nature, spiritual development, and the very purpose of religious life itself. Consider how the Gnostic approach to spiritual practice would have functioned in daily life. Instead of gathering for communal worship focused on praising a divine savior, Gnostic communities emphasized individual meditation, self-examination, and the cultivation of inner awareness. The goal wasn't to demonstrate devotion to an external deity, but to awaken the divine consciousness that already existed within each person. This shift in focus created radically different community dynamics. Rather than hierarchical structures where ordained priests mediated between God and believers, Gnostic groups operated more like philosophical schools where advanced practitioners guided newcomers in developing their own direct spiritual insight. Authority came from demonstrated wisdom and understanding, not from institutional appointment or apostolic succession. The Gospel of Philip describes this educational approach in detail, presenting development as a gross spiritual dual process of awakening that anyone could undertake. The text uses marriage metaphors to describe different stages of consciousness integration, suggesting that spiritual maturity involved balancing and harmonizing various aspects of one's inner nature, rather than suppressing or transcending them. What emerges from these descriptions is a form of Christianity that looks remarkably similar to what we might today call transpersonal psychology or contemplative spirituality. The emphasis on consciousness transformation, the recognition of multiple levels of psychological development, the integration of masculine and feminine principles, even the understanding of spiritual crisis as necessary for growth, all align with contemporary approaches to human potential and personal development. The Secret Book of John takes this psychological interpretation even further, describing the process of awakening as a systematic undoing of false identifications and limiting beliefs. According to this text, humans suffer not because they violated divine commands, but because they've forgotten their true nature and become identified with temporary roles and circumstances. Salvation involves remembering who they really are beneath all the conditioning and social programming. This therapeutic approach to spirituality would have been revolutionary in the ancient world, where psychological concepts were barely developed and mental suffering was often attributed to divine punishment or demonic possession. The Gnostic texts present Jesus as something like a spiritual therapist, someone who helps people identify and release the unconscious patterns that keep them trapped in cycles of suffering and confusion. The Gospel of Mary provides fascinating insight into how this therapeutic process might have worked in practice. When Mary describes her private conversations with Jesus, she presents him as someone who asked probing questions designed to reveal hidden assumptions and beliefs. Rather than providing dogmatic answers, he guided people toward their own discoveries about the nature of reality and their place within it. This Socratic approach to spiritual teaching stands in stark contrast to the authoritarian model that developed in Orthodox Christianity. Instead of demanding faith in revealed truths, the Gnostic Jesus encouraged critical thinking, personal experimentation, and direct verification of spiritual claims through inner experience. Students were expected to test teachings against their own developing understanding, rather than accept them based on external authority. The implications of this approach for religious authority were profound and threatening to establish power structures. If individuals could develop direct access to spiritual truth through their own inner work, what need was there for institutional mediation? If personal experience was the ultimate criterion for spiritual validity, how could church leaders maintain doctrinal control? If awakening was available to everyone regardless of social position, education, or gender, what justified ecclesiastical hierarchies? The Gospel of Judas addresses these questions directly by presenting a Jesus who explicitly rejects the entire system of religious authority and ritual sacrifice that was developing around his movement. According to this text, Jesus actually laughed when he saw his disciples performing communion rituals, recognizing that they had missed the point of his teachings and were recreating the same external religious practices he had tried to help them transcend. This scene provides a chilling critique of what Christianity was becoming even during the apostolic period. The disciples, well-meaning but still identified with conventional religious thinking, were transforming Jesus' message of inner awakening into another system of external observances and institutional structures. They were creating exactly the kind of religion Jesus had spent his ministry trying to help people move beyond. The text suggests that Jesus foresaw this development and understood it was probably inevitable. Human consciousness tends to externalize spiritual insights, turning direct experiences into conceptual beliefs and personal relationships into institutional structures. The tragedy wasn't that this happened, but that the original experiential dimension of his teaching was lost in the process. This psychological interpretation of Jesus' mission helps explain why the Gnostic texts place so much emphasis on secrecy and hidden knowledge. The deepest spiritual truths can't be communicated through ordinary language or conceptual instruction. They require direct experience, personal verification, and gradual integration over time. Attempting to make them widely accessible through institutional channels inevitably leads to distortion and misunderstanding. The Gospel of Thomas makes this point repeatedly through Jesus' cryptic sayings and paradoxical statements. When disciples ask for clear explanations, Jesus responds with riddles and metaphors that force them to engage their own intuitive understanding rather than relying on intellectual analysis. The goal isn't to provide information, but to catalyze insight, not to answer questions, but to provoke deeper questioning. This pedagogical approach explains why many of the Gnostic texts seem deliberately obscure and difficult to understand. They weren't designed to communicate doctrine, but to stimulate awakening, not to inform the mind, but to activate dormant capacities for direct spiritual perception. Reading them required active participation rather than passive reception, personal engagement rather than scholarly analysis. The practical implications of this approach extended to every aspect of spiritual life, including the controversial question of Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene. Rather than focusing on whether they were romantically involved, the Gnostic texts use their partnership to illustrate principles of consciousness integration and spiritual collaboration that were central to the awakening process. The Gospel of Philip presents their relationship as a model for the kind of spiritual intimacy that becomes possible when two people recognize each other's divine nature. This isn't ordinary human love based on attraction and attachment, but what the text calls spiritual marriage, a union of consciousness that transcends individual identity while honoring each person's unique contribution to the relationship. This interpretation transforms Mary Magdalene from a supporting character in Jesus' story into a central figure whose own spiritual development paralleled and complemented his. She wasn't just a devoted follower, but a spiritual peer whose insights and understanding were essential to the full expression of the wisdom they both embodied. The tensions this created with other disciples reflect broader conflicts about the nature of spiritual authority and the possibility of genuine spiritual equality between men and women. The Gospel of Mary suggests that Peter's resistance to Mary's teaching role stemmed not just from cultural prejudice, but from his own spiritual limitations, his inability to recognize divine wisdom regardless of its source. These gender dynamics reveal deeper issues about how spiritual communities organize themselves and distribute authority. The Gnostic approach, which emphasized inner development over external credentials, naturally led to more egalitarian structures, where anyone could potentially achieve recognition based on their level of understanding. This threatened traditional power arrangements and social hierarchies in ways that extended far beyond religious contexts. The Secret Book of John explores these themes through its complex cosmological narrative, which can be read as an allegory for psychological and social development. The false god Yaldabaoth represents not just cosmic ignorance, but the tendency of unconscious authority figures to demand worship and obedience from those they claim to serve. The divine sparks, trapped in material bodies, symbolize not just individual souls, but oppressed populations whose true potential has been suppressed by unjust social systems. This political interpretation of Gnostic mythology helps explain why these texts were so threatening to Roman authorities as well as church leaders. They didn't just challenge religious orthodoxy, but questioned the entire foundation of hierarchical social organization. If every person contained divine potential that could be awakened through proper understanding, then what justified systems based on permanent inequality and subordination? The Gospel of Thomas makes this revolutionary implication explicit in several sayings, where Jesus speaks about overturning existing power structures and creating new forms of social organization based on spiritual rather than material values. He talks about the first becoming last and the last becoming first, not as a future reversal in some heavenly kingdom, but as a present possibility available to anyone willing to abandon conventional thinking about status and authority. These themes resonated powerfully with marginalized groups throughout the Roman Empire, who found in Gnostic Christianity a spiritual framework that validated their experiences of oppression while offering hope for transformation. Women, slaves, ethnic minorities, and others excluded from positions of power could see themselves as possessing the same divine potential as their social superiors, needing only proper knowledge and spiritual practice to realize their true nature. The appeal of this message helps explain why Gnostic Christianity spread so rapidly in certain regions and social contexts, even as it faced increasing opposition from Orthodox church leaders allied with Roman authorities. It offered not just personal salvation, but social liberation. Not just individual awakening, but collective transformation based on recognition of universal human dignity and potential. The suppression of these texts therefore represented not just theological correction, but political control, an attempt to prevent spiritual insights that might challenge existing power arrangements from spreading throughout the empire. The Jesus who taught spiritual equality and individual empowerment was replaced by a Jesus who emphasized submission to authority and acceptance of social hierarchy as divinely ordained. This historical context helps us understand why the rediscovery of these texts has been so controversial in contemporary Christianity. They don't just offer alternative interpretations of ancient events, but challenge ongoing power structures within religious institutions. The democratic, experiential spirituality they represent threatens established patterns of authority and control that have persisted for centuries. Modern church leaders face the same dilemma their ancient predecessors confronted when dealing with Gnostic ideas. How can institutional Christianity accommodate teachings that fundamentally question the need for institutional mediation? How can hierarchical structures incorporate insights that emphasize spiritual equality and direct access to divine truth? How can established authorities maintain their position when confronted with texts that suggest such authority is unnecessary or even harmful? These tensions explain why academic study of the Nag Hammadi texts has often been isolated from mainstream Christian theology and practice. Scholarly analysis can be contained within university settings, where it doesn't directly challenge institutional structures. But integrating Gnostic insights into contemporary Christian life would require fundamental changes in how churches organize themselves and understand their mission. Some progressive Christian movements have attempted this integration, developing forms of worship and community life that incorporate Gnostic emphasis on inner experience, gender equality, and democratic decision-making. These experiments face significant resistance from more traditional Christian communities, but offer glimpses of what Christianity might look like if it fully embraced the spiritual democracy the Gnostic texts represent. The broader cultural impact of the Nag Hammadi discovery extends well beyond Christian circles, influencing movements ranging from feminist spirituality to New Age philosophy to secular humanistic psychology. The core Gnostic insight that every person possesses inherent dignity and unlimited potential for development resonates with contemporary values about human rights, personal growth, and social justice. This resonance suggests that the spiritual hunger these texts address isn't confined to religious contexts, but reflects deeper human needs for meaning, purpose, and authentic spiritual experience that transcend institutional boundaries. The Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels speaks to seekers regardless of their religious background, offering a vision of spiritual development that emphasizes direct experience over dogmatic belief. The question facing contemporary spirituality is whether these ancient insights can be integrated into modern life without losing their transformative power. The Gnostic texts weren't just intellectual curiosities, but practical guides for consciousness development that required serious commitment and sustained practice to implement effectively. Their wisdom can't be reduced to inspirational quotes or self-help techniques without losing the depth that made them spiritually significant. Yet the alternative vision they offer remains compelling precisely because it addresses problems that institutional religion has never adequately resolved. The authoritarianism, gender inequality, and emphasis on external conformity that characterize much of organized Christianity stem directly from the suppression of the more democratic, egalitarian, and experiential approaches preserved in the Gnostic texts. The ongoing dialogue between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity therefore involves more than historical curiosity or academic debate. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority, the possibility of direct divine experience, and the purpose of religious community that remain as relevant today as they were in the early centuries of Christian development. The secret texts that emerged from the Egyptian desert continue to challenge our assumptions about spiritual life and religious truth, offering alternatives to patterns of thought and practice that have dominated Western spirituality for over 1,500 years. Whether their vision of an awakened humanity can be realized in contemporary contexts remains an open question, but their rediscovery has already begun transforming how many people understand the possibilities and purposes of spiritual development. The conversation between these ancient voices and contemporary seekers has only just begun, but it promises to reshape our understanding of Christianity's origins, human spiritual potential, and the ultimate meaning of religious life itself. The Jesus who taught that the kingdom of heaven exists within each person speaks again through these recovered texts, inviting a new generation to discover what their ancestors were forbidden to explore. The challenge for modern readers isn't just understanding what these texts say, but grappling with what their existence means for everything we thought we knew about Christianity's origins. If the Gnostic Gospels preserve authentic early Christian traditions, then the religion that conquered Rome and shaped Western civilization may have been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of its founder's actual message. This possibility becomes even more unsettling when we examine how systematically these alternative voices were silenced. The suppression of Gnostic Christianity wasn't a gradual theological evolution where better ideas naturally replaced inferior ones. It was a deliberate campaign of persecution, book burning, and historical revisionism that eliminated competing interpretations of Jesus' teachings through force rather than reasoned argument. The mechanics of this suppression reveal disturbing patterns that extend far beyond ancient religious disputes. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, and later emperors made it the official religion of Rome, church leaders gained access to imperial power that could be used to enforce doctrinal conformity. Texts that contradicted approved teachings were confiscated and destroyed. Communities that practiced alternative forms of Christianity were disbanded or forced underground. The Gospel of Thomas disappeared from circulation, not because its teachings were proven false, but because possessing it became dangerous. The secret book of John survived only in hidden copies because reading it publicly could result in exile or death. The Gospel of Mary was preserved only because someone buried it in a desert jar, knowing that surface possession would lead to persecution. This historical context raises uncomfortable questions about how religious truth gets determined. The Christianity that emerged victorious from these 4th century conflicts wasn't necessarily more authentic or spiritually valuable than the alternatives that were suppressed. It was simply better organized, more politically savvy, and more willing to use imperial power to eliminate competition. The Jesus of Orthodox Christianity became the official Jesus, not through spiritual merit, but through political maneuvering. The councils that defined his divine nature and established the biblical canon weren't guided by mystical insight or direct revelation, but by the same kinds of power struggles and compromise negotiations that characterize any political process. The Gnostic texts force us to confront this uncomfortable reality about how religious authority actually functions. They remind us that every sacred tradition, no matter how ancient or revered, represents choices made by human beings with their own agendas, limitations, and blind spots. The Christianity we inherited was shaped as much by political calculation as by spiritual wisdom. This doesn't necessarily invalidate Orthodox Christian doctrine, but it does complicate any claims about its exclusive validity. The Jesus who was declared to be the second person of the Trinity at the Council of Nicaea was as much a product of imperial politics as theological insight. The biblical canon that excluded the Gnostic Gospels reflected the preferences of church leaders who had already decided what Christianity should look like. When we read the Nag Hammadi texts with this historical awareness, they don't just offer alternative interpretations of ancient events. They provide glimpses of spiritual possibilities that were deliberately erased from Christian memory, insights that might have led Christianity in entirely different directions if political circumstances had been different. The Gospel of Philip's vision of spiritual marriage as consciousness integration could have developed into sophisticated approaches to human sexuality and relationships that honored both physical and spiritual dimensions of intimate connection. The Gospel of Mary's portrayal of women as spiritual equals could have prevented centuries of gender-based religious discrimination. The Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on direct spiritual experience could have fostered contemplative traditions that valued inner development over external conformity. Instead, these possibilities were cut short by leaders who preferred institutional control to spiritual freedom, hierarchical authority to democratic participation, doctrinal uniformity to experiential diversity. The Christianity that survived was the one most compatible with imperial power structures, not necessarily the one most faithful to its founder's vision. This realization transforms how we read even the canonical Gospels. When Matthew presents Jesus saying he came to fulfill the law rather than abolish it, we might wonder if this represents authentic teaching or later editorial work designed to make Christianity more acceptable to Jewish converts. When Luke emphasizes Jesus' concern for the poor and marginalized, we can ask whether this social justice message was central to his ministry or a later addition by communities facing Roman oppression. The Gospel of John's high Christology, with its declarations of Jesus' divine nature, looks particularly suspicious when compared to the more human Jesus of the Gnostic texts. Statements like, "Before Abraham was I am, and I and the Father are one," might represent the kinds of later theological developments that the Gnostic communities explicitly rejected. The Gnostic Jesus consistently deflects such claims about his divine status, pointing instead to the divine potential present in all humans. This pattern suggests that the movement away from Jesus as wisdom teacher toward Jesus as divine object of worship happened gradually, perhaps without anyone fully recognizing how dramatically it was changing the original message. The Gospel of Judas provides the most explicit transformation critique of this, presenting Jesus as someone who foresaw and lamented how his teachings would be distorted. According to this text, Jesus knew that his disciples would create exactly the kind of sacrificial religious system he had spent his ministry trying to help people transcend. This prophetic dimension of the Gnostic texts adds another layer to their contemporary relevance. They don't just preserve ancient alternatives to Orthodox Christianity, they anticipate many of the problems that would plague institutional Christianity throughout its history. The authoritarianism, corruption, violence, and spiritual emptiness that have characterized much of organized religion stem directly from the replacement of direct spiritual experience with external religious authority. The Jesus who emerges from these secret texts wouldn't recognize the religion that claims his name today. The elaborate rituals, hierarchical structures, doctrinal requirements, and institutional bureaucracies that define modern Christianity would be as foreign to him as they were to the Gnostic communities that tried to preserve his original message. This disconnection between the historical Jesus and institutional Christianity isn't just an academic observation with no practical implications. It suggests that people seeking authentic spiritual development might need to look beyond traditional Christian channels to find the kind of transformative wisdom Jesus actually taught. The growing interest in contemplative practices, meditation techniques, consciousness studies, and alternative spirituality reflects this search for direct spiritual experience that institutional Christianity often fails to provide. Many contemporary seekers are unconsciously gravitating toward the same kinds of inner-focused, experiential approaches that the Gnostic Christians developed 2,000 years ago. The irony is that these modern spiritual movements often look to Eastern traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, or Taoism for the very insights that were present in early Christianity, but systematically suppressed by later church development. The mindfulness practices being taught in secular contexts today bear striking similarities to the consciousness techniques described in Gnostic texts. The Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on present-moment awareness, the secret book of John's analysis of how consciousness becomes trapped in limiting identifications, the Gospel of Philip's understanding of psychological integration, all anticipate concepts that contemporary psychology and spirituality have rediscovered through other sources. This suggests that the Gnostic texts might serve as bridges between traditional Christianity and modern spiritual seeking, offering resources for people who want to explore Jesus' teachings without accepting the institutional package that typically comes with them. They present a Christianity that's compatible with scientific understanding, psychological insight, and democratic values. The challenge is that these texts require serious study and sustained practice to understand properly. They can't be reduced to simple formulas or inspirational messages without losing the depth that made them spiritually significant. The Gnostic path demands intellectual rigor, emotional maturity, and spiritual commitment that goes far beyond conventional religious participation. This difficulty probably contributed to their historical suppression as much as political considerations did. It's much easier to build mass religious movements around external authorities and simple beliefs than around complex inner work that requires years of dedicated practice to master. The Gnostic approach to Christianity was inherently elite in the sense that it demanded more from practitioners than most people were willing to invest. Yet this same difficulty might be what makes these teachings especially relevant for contemporary audiences who have access to educational resources and psychological understanding that weren't available in the ancient world. Modern readers can approach the Gnostic texts with conceptual frameworks and analytical tools that help decode their symbolic language and practical applications. The integration of Gnostic insights with contemporary knowledge creates possibilities for spiritual development that neither ancient nor modern approaches could achieve alone. The psychological sophistication of current therapeutic methods combined with the consciousness techniques preserved in these secret texts might produce forms of transformative practice that surpass what either tradition could accomplish independently. This synthetic approach doesn't require abandoning either scientific rationality or spiritual aspiration. The Gnostic understanding of consciousness as fundamental reality actually aligns well with current developments in neuroscience, quantum physics, and systems theory that suggest mind and matter are more intimately connected than classical materialism assumed. The Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels speaks to this emerging worldview in ways that the Orthodox Christ cannot. His message of human potential and direct divine access resonates with contemporary understanding of consciousness, creativity, and personal development, while maintaining the spiritual depth and transformative power that purely secular approaches often lack. The question facing modern Christianity is whether it can accommodate these rediscovered dimensions of its founders' teaching without abandoning the institutional structures and traditional beliefs that have sustained it for centuries. Some progressive Christian movements are attempting this integration, but they face resistance from more conservative elements that see any deviation from orthodox doctrine as dangerous compromise. The tension between institutional preservation and spiritual renewal that these texts create isn't unique to Christianity. All established religious traditions face similar challenges when confronted with evidence that their official versions of history might be incomplete or biased. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library forces Christianity to confront this challenge more directly than most religions have had to do. The outcome of this confrontation will likely determine Christianity's relevance for future generations who have access to these alternative perspectives on Jesus' life and teachings. A Christianity that continues to insist on the exclusive validity of orthodox interpretations while ignoring or dismissing the Gnostic evidence will increasingly appear defensive and intellectually dishonest to educated audiences. But a Christianity that can integrate the insights preserved in these secret texts while maintaining connection to its historical roots might discover resources for renewal that could revitalize the tradition for contemporary contexts. The Jesus who taught spiritual equality and direct divine experience offers possibilities for Christian practice that could address many of the problems that have made institutional religion irrelevant or harmful for growing numbers of people. The conversation between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity that was interrupted in the 4th century has resumed with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts. The questions these ancient voices raise about spiritual authority, religious truth, and human potential remain as challenging today as they were 1600 years ago. How that conversation develops will shape not only the future of Christianity, but the broader landscape of human spirituality. In an age when traditional certainties are dissolving and new possibilities are emerging. The secret texts buried in the Egyptian desert have returned to challenge assumptions that seemed permanently settled about Christianity's origins and meaning. They remind us that the religion that conquered the Roman Empire and shaped Western civilization was not inevitable, not the only possible interpretation of Jesus' revolutionary message about human dignity and spiritual potential. The Jesus who never wanted to be God continues to speak through these recovered voices, offering a vision of awakened humanity that transcends the limitations of institutional religion, while honoring the depths of spiritual wisdom that originally inspired the Christian movement. Whether contemporary audiences will have the courage to hear this message and explore its implications remains one of the most significant questions facing religion and spirituality in the 21st century. The implications extend beyond personal spiritual development to encompass broader questions about authority, truth, and human possibility that affect every aspect of contemporary life. The democratic, experiential spirituality preserved in the Gnostic texts offers alternatives to authoritarian patterns of thinking and social organization that have dominated human civilization for millennia. The Jesus of these secret Gospels speaks not just to religious seekers, but to anyone concerned with human freedom, dignity, and potential. His message that every person contains divine wisdom and creative power challenges systems based on permanent inequality and subordination, regardless of whether they're religious, political, or economic in nature. The ongoing rediscovery of these ancient insights therefore represents more than historical curiosity or theological debate. It points toward possibilities for human development and social organization that could transform not only religious life, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The conversation has only just begun, but already these buried voices are changing how millions of people understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the cosmos. The Jesus who taught that the kingdom of heaven exists within each person has returned to invite a new generation of seekers to explore territories of consciousness and possibility that their ancestors were forbidden to enter. The farmer's shovel that struck clay in the Egyptian desert 79 years ago didn't just uncover ancient manuscripts. It unearthed a question that refuses to stay buried. After examining these secret texts, after tracing their suppression through the corridors of imperial power, after witnessing how systematically alternative voices were silenced, we're left with an inescapable reality. The Jesus of Orthodox Christianity and the Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels cannot both be historically accurate. One represents authentic teaching, the other a later invention designed to serve institutional needs rather than spiritual truth. The evidence suggests which version deserves our attention. The Gnostic Jesus who deflected worship, who taught inner awakening, who treated disciples as equals rather than subordinates, who emphasized human potential over human depravity, aligns with the kind of wisdom teacher who could have inspired a revolutionary spiritual movement. The Orthodox Jesus, who claimed exclusive divinity, demanded worship, and established hierarchical religious structures, sounds remarkably similar to the imperial religions that Christianity supposedly replaced. These texts don't just challenge Christian doctrine, they reveal possibilities for human development that were deliberately erased from Western spiritual memory. The democratic, experiential approach to the divine that they preserve offers resources for consciousness transformation that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. Whether we choose to explore these possibilities or continue accepting the limitations imposed by institutional interpretations will determine not only the future of Christianity, but the trajectory of human spiritual development itself. The secret Gospels have returned. The question is whether we have the courage to hear what they're actually saying